Madelyn always had a special sensitivity for capturing emotions around her. Since childhood, she enjoyed observing people, trying to imagine their stories just by their gestures, glances, and silences. This ability ended up shaping her professional life, and years later, she found her true calling as an art restorer. Her work required patience and a keen eye for details, something that had always come naturally to her. Every day, Madelyn spent hours inside her studio, carefully analyzing the faded brush strokes of old canvases, bringing back to life the colors that time had erased. She worked alone most of the time, surrounded by paints, brushes, and the scent of varnish. There was genuine satisfaction in restoring the brightness of something that seemed lost. However, her personal life was very different from the delicacy she applied to paintings. She lived in a small apartment in the heart of the city, decorated with unfinished paintings that gathered dust on the walls. She rarely went out, mostly just to buy supplies or deliver a restored piece. Relationships were never a priority for her. In her silent world, the details in paintings told stories that, in a way, fulfilled her need for connection. On the other side of the city, Charlie led a completely different routine. As an architect, his life revolved around numbers, precise calculations, and projects that defied gravity. Unlike Madelyn, his work involved constant daily interactions, meetings with clients, endless phone calls, and tight deadlines. The chaos of construction contrasted with his need for order, and perhaps that was why he always sought refuge in the same coffee shop every morning. It was there, in that small space filled with the aroma of fresh coffee and warm bread, that he found a brief moment of peace before facing the rush of the day. He always sat in the same spot, near the window, where he could watch the movement of the street without having to engage with it. The predictability of that routine brought him a comfort that few things in life could offer. But destiny has curious ways of bringing paths together. On that particular morning, Madelyn had to leave her studio earlier than usual. A client had requested that she personally deliver a restored painting to an office downtown. The sky was overcast, and rain seemed inevitable, but she decided to walk anyway. She carried the carefully wrapped painting, holding it tightly in her arms. She walked quickly, trying to dodge the people crossing her path, until a strong gust of wind turned the odds against her. The paper wrapping the painting slipped from her hands, revealing part of the artwork as it twirled in the air. Shocked, Madelyn tried to catch it, but her steps were suddenly halted when she bumped into someone. The impact made her lose her balance for a moment, but the real problem was what happened to the canvas. It fell directly onto a freshly served cup of coffee. Charlie barely had time to react. He felt the heat of the liquid spreading across the table and heard the muffled sound of the canvas hitting the wet surface. The coffee formed small dark stains along the lower edge of the painting, and Madelyn stood frozen for a few seconds, trying to process what had just happened. Her heart pounded. Restoring an old artwork was a meticulous and often delicate job. Even a small stain could compromise days of effort. She quickly grabbed the canvas, assessing the damage, while the strong scent of coffee filled the air. Charlie, on the other hand, picked up a napkin and began wiping the table, feeling a mix of surprise and frustration at the unexpected situation. The rain, which had previously only threatened to fall, began to drip slowly outside, creating small ripples in the puddles forming on the sidewalk. The muffled sound of raindrops hitting the cafe's window seemed to make the moment even more surreal. And so, in the chaos of an ordinary morning, two very different worlds crossed paths for the first time. Madelyn was still holding the coffee-stained canvas when a thought struck her like lightning. Had she just ruined weeks of work? The dark liquid was already seeping into the fabric, slowly infiltrating the delicate brushstrokes she had worked so hard to restore. Anxiety climbed up her throat, a tight knot forming in her chest. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the artwork toward the light, trying to gauge the extent of the damage, but the damage was already done. Meanwhile, Charlie continued wiping the table, his movements automatic, as if processing the situation in slow motion. He observed the woman's expression, a mix of disbelief and concern. Something about the way she held the canvas, with an almost reverent care, made him realize that this wasn't just any object. Outside, the once gentle rain began to intensify. The drops became heavier, drumming against the cafe's glass in a steady rhythm. Some people quickened their pace along the sidewalk, opening umbrellas in synchronized motions, while others simply accepted the inevitable and allowed themselves to get wet. Madelyn, however, seemed unaware of any of it. Her entire focus was on the artwork in her hands. She took a deep breath, trying to regain composure. There was nothing she could do at that moment to undo what had happened. Finally, she lifted her eyes for the first time and met Charlie's gaze. He watched her in silence, his expression carrying a mix of curiosity and a faint trace of concern. There was something strange about that exchange of looks. It wasn't just a casual encounter, an accident between two strangers who, under normal circumstances, would simply apologize and move on. There was an invisible weight in the air, as if the universe had chosen that moment, that exact place, to intertwine their destinies. But what could possibly exist between two complete strangers? Charlie looked away for a brief moment, crumpling the napkin between his fingers and tossing it into the small trash bin beside the table. The motion seemed to bring a pragmatic closure to the incident. Yet, when he looked at Madelyn again, he realized there was still something there, an invisible thread, a connection neither of them could explain. Madelyn pressed her lips together, clutching the painting tightly against her chest. Her instincts told her it was time to leave, but for some reason, her feet hesitated. It was only when a distant thunder rumbled, making the cafe windows vibrate slightly, that she finally moved. With one last glance at the stained canvas, she turned on her heels and hurried out, feeling the cold, damp wind of the street brush against her face. Charlie watched her silhouette until she disappeared into the crowd. The murmur of conversations around him gradually filled the cafe again, and life went on as usual. But he knew something had changed. He could feel it. And outside, as the rain poured harder, Madelyn knew it too. Even without fully understanding why, there was a restless feeling inside her, something that insisted on telling her that this encounter had not been a mere coincidence. In the days that followed the unexpected encounter at the cafe, Madelyn tried to go about her routine, but something inside her felt off. The coffee-stained canvas rested on a table in her studio, waiting for her to decide what to do about the damage. She could try to restore it again, cover the marks with new layers of paint, but something held her back. It was as if that stain was more than just an accident. It was a marker of something she couldn't yet understand. But life didn't stop. New projects arose. Deadlines had to be met. And soon, the cafe incident became just a recurring thought, something that surfaced in her mind during moments of silence. Charlie, on the other hand, couldn't ignore that morning either. Although he was used to a meticulously organized routine, something about that encounter lingered in his memory. He didn't quite understand why, but sometimes, while reviewing projects at the office or rushing between meetings, he found himself replaying the scene. Madelyn's gaze fixed on the canvas, the way she held the painting as if carrying something precious, and the way she had disappeared into the crowd without saying a word. Fate, however, didn't seem willing to let them go their separate ways. A few weeks later, Madelyn received a new restoration request. This time, it was a large mural located in the lobby of a commercial building. The job would require days of dedication, as the cracks in the painting were deep, and the humidity had compromised much of the original colors. She accepted the challenge without hesitation, as mural art had always held a special admiration for her. What she didn't know was that the building belonged to one of the city's largest architecture firms, and that Charlie was one of the people overseeing the renovation project. When she arrived for the first site inspection, carrying her tools and pigment samples, she didn't immediately notice the coincidence. She focused on the work, analyzing the painting's deterioration, measuring the damage, and making meticulous notes. It was only when she finished filling out her initial report and lifted her eyes that she met a familiar figure. Charlie was just a few feet away, talking with a group of engineers about the building's structure. But when he noticed Madelyn standing there, for a moment, he completely lost track of the conversation. The surprise was mutual. Neither of them had expected to cross paths again, especially in such a different setting from their first encounter. But there they were, connected by a coincidence that didn't seem so accidental after all. Charlie watched as Madelyn turned her attention back to the mural, running her fingers gently over the cracked surface. Even without understanding why this encounter affected him so strangely, he knew it couldn't be ignored. Days passed, and the work on the mural progressed. Madelyn arrived early, equipped with brushes, solvents, and endless patience. Charlie, in turn, was always nearby, monitoring the building's renovations. Although their interactions were limited to exchanged glances from a distance and brief moments shared in the elevator or at the lobby cafe, something was growing, a feeling, a silent presence that connected them even without words. And then, Small gestures began to emerge. Charlie, without fully knowing why, started adjusting his routine slightly. Whenever possible, he made sure to have coffee at the same time Madelyn took a break. He would sit at a nearby table, never intruding on her space, just being there, as if his simple presence was enough to fill an invisible void. Madelyn, on the other hand, began noticing details she hadn't before, like the fact that Charlie liked to sketch buildings on napkins when he was deep in thought, or that he always furrowed his brows when trying to remember something important. The connection between them grew subtly, like a thread being woven little by little, with no rush, no grand declarations. It simply existed. However, not everything was simple. The differences between their lives soon became evident. While Madelyn lived by art and patience, Charlie was governed by tight deadlines and unattainable expectations. His schedule rarely allowed time for anything beyond work, and he knew that any emotional involvement would require space that, at that moment, he wasn't sure he had. Madelyn, on the other hand, had always kept her distance from anything that threatened her independence. She had built her life around the freedom to move at her own pace, without relying on anyone, without having to adjust her days to accommodate someone else. And then came the first major misunderstanding. It was a particularly chaotic day at the construction site. The deadline for completing the renovations was tight, and Charlie was under enormous pressure to deliver the expected results. When Madelyn arrived that morning, she sensed the tension in the air, workers rushing back and forth, orders being given in firm tones, and Charlie, at the center of it all, trying to solve a last-minute structural issue. She headed to the mural as she always did, ignoring the commotion around her. But then, a decision was made without her being consulted. Charlie, pressured by time and the need to speed up the renovations, determined that part of the lobby needed to be repainted with a different approach, removing a section of the mural that Madelyn was still restoring. To him, it was just a practical matter. To her, it was a blatant disregard for her work and the art she was dedicated to preserving. When she discovered the decision, she felt a weight in her chest, a mix of frustration and disappointment. She hadn't expected Charlie to be the kind of person who would discard something so significant for the sake of convenience. By the end of the day, when he tried to explain, he realized that an unexpected barrier had risen between them. The hurt in Madelyn's eyes spoke louder than any words. Charlie didn't know what to say. For the first time since meeting her, he felt that maybe the connection between them was about to unravel. And so, without a single goodbye, Madelyn gathered her tools and left, without looking back. Charlie stood there, watching Madelyn walk away, feeling the weight of the distance between them, more imposing than any of the projects he had ever faced. She walked with her head held high, but there was a lightness in her steps that he had never noticed before. Something about the way she carried her frustration like a second skin made him feel even more guilty. That night, Charlie tried to focus on his work, but the truth was that his mind was elsewhere. Madelyn occupied his thoughts in an unexpected way. He thought about the time he had spent watching the mural, the attention she gave to every stroke, every color. To him, it seemed like she was putting a piece of her soul into that painting. The mural wasn't just a work of art, it was an extension of her world, and now he had hurt her without even realizing it. He wondered how much it truly meant to her, and how much he really knew about her. Madelyn didn't have a peaceful night either. When she got home, she threw her tools onto the table and stood there, staring at the unfinished mural in front of her. The coffee-stained painting now seemed like a perfect reflection of what she was feeling. The frustration didn't come just from what had happened at the site, but also from the sensation of drifting away from something that, until then, had felt so natural. Why had this connection with Charlie become so complicated? She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to make sense of it all. There was no logic to what was happening between her and Charlie. They were from such different worlds, like two parallel lines that had suddenly crossed without warning. It was impossible to ignore the fact that they were fighting against invisible forces, trying to understand what exactly was at stake between them. The next day arrived, and the tension between them was palpable. Madelyn, for her part, decided not to go to work that morning. She needed time for herself, to try to sort out her thoughts. Charlie, unsure of how to approach the situation, also avoided going to the site that day. Both of them were stuck in a sort of limbo, unsure of how to rebuild what had been so suddenly broken. 2 days of absolute silence passed between them, each wondering if that misunderstanding had been the end of a story they hadn't even had the chance to live. But fate, as always, had other plans. On the third day, Charlie woke up determined to resolve the situation. He knew he couldn't leave things like this, without an explanation, without an apology. When he arrived at the building, he asked the workers if Madelyn had returned. It wasn't hard to find her. She was in the lobby, working on another part of the mural that he hadn't seen before. She was alone, focused, completely immersed in her work, as if that was the only place where she felt in control. Charlie approached, hesitant, but determined. There was no more room for empty words or superficial apologies. He knew she deserved something more, something real. When she saw him coming, her eyes hardened instantly. It was as if she had built an invisible barrier around herself, protecting herself from a pain she still couldn't fully understand. He stopped a few steps away, feeling the tension in the air. "I was wrong," Charlie finally found his voice. "I did something you didn't deserve. I didn't think about the consequences." Madelyn looked at him for a long moment, but didn't respond immediately. Her gaze was a mix of pain and frustration. She wasn't ready to give in, but the sincerity in Charlie's voice made her question her own resistance. For a moment, she allowed herself to listen to his words without rushing to react. "I made mistakes too," she finally replied, her voice soft but full of meaning. "I'm not good at trusting people. I build walls, and then wonder why I feel so alone." Charlie felt a pang in his chest at her words. He knew that in some way, she was right. They were fighting against something much bigger than themselves, something neither of them fully understood. But he wanted to try. He wanted them to give themselves a chance. He took a step forward, with a calmness he hadn't known he possessed. "I don't know what the future holds, Madelyn, but I know I don't want to lose the chance to find out. I want us to be able to look back and know we did our best." Madelyn looked at him for a moment, her gaze softer than before but still cautious. She knew that the decision to forgive, to move forward, wasn't simple, but something inside her told her she was ready to try. "I don't want to lose this chance either," she finally said, her eyes now locked on his. "But that means we need to be honest with each other, and things won't be easy." Charlie smiled, not a victorious smile, but one of relief. "I'm ready." And at that moment, something began to change. The invisible wall between them started to crumble, slowly. It wasn't an instant solution, but there was a silent understanding between them, an unspoken promise that the journey would be more important than the obstacles ahead. The connection between them, though still fragile, was now deeper than ever, and for the first time, they both felt that they had taken the first step toward a future that, while uncertain, was clearer than before. Even though they had taken the first step toward reconciliation, something between Madelyn and Charlie still felt incomplete. What started as a sincere attempt to understand and accept their differences had turned into a series of unresolved misunderstandings, small, invisible, but lingering in the air, preventing them from moving forward as they had hoped. The truth was that, although they both wanted to be closer, their lives seemed to be heading in different directions. Madelyn continued her routine of restorations, immersed in her studio and her artistic world, a place where the chaos of the outside world was softened by brushstrokes and color. She felt comfortable there, but she also knew something was missing. She wanted more but didn't know how to ask for it, as if what she desired most was just out of reach. Charlie, on the other hand, was increasingly consumed by the demands of his job. Tight deadlines, endless meetings, and the pressure to deliver results were beginning to wear him down. Madelyn's presence still occupied his thoughts, but he didn't know how to balance his career demands with his desire to be with her. He knew she deserved more than just empty promises, but as always, he found himself caught in the whirlwind of the corporate world, where everything seemed urgent, yet nothing felt truly important. That was when the great misunderstanding happened, separating them in an irrevocable way. It happened so suddenly that Madelyn didn't have time to process it. During a work meeting, Charlie received an offer that could change the course of his career, a contract with a foreign company for a major new project. He was excited, but also aware that it meant more hours devoted to work, more travel, and less time for himself. He had to make a tough choice: continue with the project he had started in the city, or accept the new opportunity that could change his life. When the proposal was formally presented, he found himself torn between his professional ambitions and what he felt for Madelyn. The solution seemed simple, but the pressure on Charlie made him act impulsively. He didn't tell Madelyn about the offer, not directly. Instead, Without thinking about the implications, he shared the news with one of his colleagues, mentioning that he would need to travel in the coming days to discuss further details about the project. He casually mentioned that he might no longer be directly involved in the mural, without realizing the impact this would have on Madelyn. To him, it seemed like just a professional decision. To her, it was a silent betrayal. Madelyn heard about the contract and the trip through a mutual colleague who casually mentioned Charlie's future in the project. The tone of the conversation was light, but the words cut Madelyn deeply. Not only was his work about to take up all his attention, but it also seemed like he was no longer interested in being present in her life. He hadn't mentioned anything about the trip. He hadn't said a word about his feelings or what they were building together. To her, it seemed like a clear choice. He was pulling away from her, choosing his career and professional future over her. The misunderstanding was inevitable. Madelyn, hurt and confused, made an impulsive decision. She withdrew from the mural, leaving it unfinished, and decided not to return to the work she had once loved so much. The pain of Charlie's silence turned into a radical decision. She no longer wanted to be involved with someone who could abandon her so easily. She felt stifled by the lack of communication and the overwhelming sensation that, to Charlie, her presence in his life was disposable, a mere detail in a story he was no longer willing to write. Charlie, on the other hand, was so caught up in his decision to accept the job offer that he failed to realize the gravity of his omission. He felt the growing distance between them, but believed he was making the right choice for their future. He needed to ensure stability, advance in his career, and provide for what was ahead. But the truth was, he was no longer listening to what Madelyn truly needed. He still loved her, but he didn't know how to give her the space to see that. He thought he was doing the right thing, but he was drifting away in a way he wouldn't understand until it was too late. Time passed, and life continued as if nothing had happened. Madelyn distanced herself from everything that connected her to Charlie. She focused entirely on her work, dedicating herself to the mural, unaware that the story that had started with so much promise was reaching a breaking point. Charlie traveled, consumed by his new project, and the emptiness settled into their lives. They were now in different worlds, but fate, as always, wouldn't let them drift apart so easily. That was when the role of destiny started to become clear. A few months later, Madelyn was invited to an art exhibition at a prestigious gallery in the city, where some of her works were being displayed. It was a high-profile event, and she knew it would be an excellent opportunity to showcase her art. She arrived early to help with the setup, and as she walked through the gallery, her eyes landed on a painting that made her stop in her tracks. It was an impressive piece, but something about it struck her in a peculiar way. The image of a building, the same one Charlie had designed, was there, depicted in a unique way. The artwork wasn't just a landscape, but a reconstruction of the architecture in vivid colors, reminiscent of the mural Madelyn had restored. Charlie, unknowingly, had incorporated her work into his. His project and Madelyn's artwork were now connected, not by a mural, but by something much deeper, a coincidence intertwined by invisible hands. The idea that even apart their paths continued to cross was undeniable. That was when Madelyn understood. Fate, in a subtle way, was revealing the connection between them, something greater than any of the obstacles they had faced. The art she loved so much was now intertwined with the architecture he so deeply admired. The mural, the building, the works that had once been separated were now fused together again in a way neither of them could have planned. Fate had finally spoken. Madelyn felt a strange sensation as she gazed at the artwork in the gallery. It was as if everything she had lived through with Charlie was unfolding before her, not in words or gestures, but in a painting that symbolized what they were and what they could have been. Their connection, though interrupted, was still alive deep in her soul. She looked at the painting, at the vibrant colors representing the building and the delicate outlines of its structure, and thought about how, in those early days, everything had felt so simple, so natural. They had been in sync, as if the universe had conspired to bring their souls together. Now the gallery was silent, the lights reflecting off the marble walls. But the sense of distance, once just a faint shadow, had become a painful reality. Madelyn closed her eyes for a moment, trying to take a deep breath and push away the emotions rising inside her. The last thing she wanted was to fall into the traps of the past again. She had decided to move on, but fate, as always, had other plans. The exhibition was beginning, and Madelyn found herself surrounded by admirers of her art, some even praising the painting she had been silently observing. She wasn't ready to admit the deep connection she felt, but she couldn't deny it either. That artwork represented more than just a piece of art. It was the link that still connected her to Charlie. And, as if the universe had a sense of irony, she heard his name being mentioned by one of the curators. The project he had designed for the building depicted in the painting was one of the most talked about pieces in the gallery. Without knowing it, he had poured a part of his soul into it, just as she had done with the mural. Madelyn felt a mix of emotions. Her anger and pain were still there, but now there was something more, a feeling that fate had not abandoned them. It was as if, even though they were physically apart, the universe had shaped their lives in a way that kept them connected at every moment, in ways they did not yet fully understand. As she got lost in her thoughts, someone approached her. It was a friend from college, a woman who knew her story with Charlie well. "Madelyn, have you seen Charlie's painting? That architectural project he did? It's incredible. They're saying he worked on it while he was involved with your mural. It really seems like your lives crossed in a wonderful way." Those words, though spoken with enthusiasm, fell on Madelyn like a weight. She looked at her friend with a forced smile, trying to keep her composure. "Yes, I saw it," she said, trying to hide the pain still consuming her. "It seems he found something worthwhile." Her friend, sensing Madelyn's distant tone, didn't push further, but before walking away, she left one last remark in the air. "Fate is funny, isn't it? When we least expect it, it puts things in the right place." Those words echoed in Madelyn's mind as she stepped away to find a moment of solitude. Fate truly seemed to be playing with her, placing all the signs right in front of her eyes and making her question whether things between her and Charlie were really over. She didn't know if she was ready to give in, to open her heart again, but something inside her told her she couldn't ignore what was happening. The mural, the project, the painting, everything seemed to be pointing in the same direction, as if their path had been drawn in advance. Meanwhile, Charlie was in an important meeting, discussing the project details with the new company. He felt immense pressure on his shoulders, but also a sense that something was missing, something he couldn't quite identify, but that manifested in small moments of distraction. During the meeting, he found himself thinking about Madelyn, about the last time he saw her, about the unfinished conversation they had. He wished he had been more honest, wished he had opened up to her more clearly, but he had let himself be carried away by pressure and the expectations of the world around him. When his phone rang, Charlie looked at the screen and saw an unknown number. He hesitated but answered. It was an invitation to the same art exhibition where Madelyn was. He remained silent for a few seconds, surprised and unsure. The invitation was unexpected, but he felt there was a reason for it. He knew he couldn't keep ignoring what was happening, ignoring the fact that Madelyn still held an important place in his life. Determined, he stood up, gathered his things, and left the meeting. He didn't know exactly what he expected to find at the gallery, but he felt he needed to be there, that perhaps it was his last chance to reconnect with her, to try to understand what had gone wrong between them. Fate, in its most mysterious form, was calling him. When Charlie arrived at the gallery, the atmosphere was vibrant and full of people, but as he entered, he felt a chill run down his spine, as if something was about to happen. He looked around, trying to find Madelyn, until his eyes finally landed on her. She was standing, gazing at a particular painting, immersed in its beauty and colors. Charlie approached her but said nothing. He didn't know what to say. He just wanted to be there, beside her, perhaps to understand what they had lost. Madelyn, realizing his presence, felt her heart race. It was him. Even after everything that had happened, something inside her still longed for him, still felt a deep connection with him. But at the same time, her mind was confused, full of unanswered questions. What was he doing there? What did he really want? Before she could fully process it, Charlie took a step forward, looking at the painting. "I saw the mural," he said softly, "and I saw what you did with it. I made a mistake, Madelyn. I didn't realize how I was pushing you away." And Madelyn looked at him, her eyes filled with conflicting emotions. What he was saying made sense, but she didn't know if she was ready to give in again. She needed more than empty words. She needed actions. She needed to believe that fate was truly on their side. And in that moment, they both understood that fate wasn't finished with them. It had only brought them to the place where they needed to be to start over. As the night went on and the gallery lights began to dim, the two of them stood there together, looking at the art that had united them and had also separated them. Fate, in its mysterious way, had brought them back together. They knew that although the road ahead was uncertain, they were no longer willing to run from each other. Something inside them both said that, with time, the love they had shared would be enough to overcome any obstacle. After all, the true miracle of love is not in perfection, but in how it resurfaces, even after storms, stronger and deeper. And so, amidst the beauty of colors, the stillness of the gallery, and the muffled sounds of the city in the distance, Madelyn and Charlie finally understood that fate had not only brought them together, it had prepared them for a new beginning. Together, love was, indeed, the miracle that had brought them back to each other. And as they walked away from the gallery, side by side, a new chapter of their lives began to be written. A chapter where fate would no longer separate them, but would guide them toward the eternal love they had always deserved.